Welcome back. For those that didn't listen to me last night, yes, I am in New York City, hence what you see behind me. I was supposed to be in Washington, D.C., but the flight was cancelled, so I came here instead. I'll be in D.C. tomorrow. Now, some of your thoughts coming in. Was it right to close the schools? Nick says, no, Sweden had the right idea, but what is not being talked about is the flawed model, is the same model that is being used for climate change. And these messages prove they do indeed fudge the data to suit their agenda. Gosh, Nick, you're even more cynical than I am. Michael says, hindsight is a wonderful thing. Yeah, Michael, I get that, of course. Of course, it's easy to look back and criticise. But I think what today's revelations show is the extent of the political battle that was going on within Cabinet, not a scientific one to deal with the disease. And that, I think, is what genuinely shocks people. And just think of those kids, as Christine said, those kids that went back to school for one day and were then told the schools were closed. All of that was disastrous. Another viewer says, no, students lost social skills, academic skills, and became fearful, apathetic, and hopeless. Currently, they don't see much of a future for themselves, and they lack the skills to navigate life's challenges. Well, I have to say, I for one, do genuinely think this did huge, huge damage to young people. And I'll take one more. Tessa says, easy to say no 2 years down the line. All the government were doing was trying to save lives. Even if they made mistakes, wouldn't we all have done the same? Tessa, I'll be honest with you, when that first lockdown came, and I had friends in Milan, in northern Italy, telling me what was happening in their hospitals, what was happening in their communities, I was pretty scared of what was coming down the track, and I had no objections to the first lockdown whatsoever. We didn't know what was coming down at us. But by the time we get to early 2021, we knew that the only people that died with coronavirus on their death certificates were people with an average age of 83, which is higher than normal life expectancy in the UK, and or, in many cases, people who were suffering from very bad health, pre-existing heart conditions, or extreme obesity. We knew by that time that most people that caught it got over it pretty quickly, and yet we kept going back into repeated lockdowns. So I'm not speaking on this with hindsight. I have to say, by the time the second and third lockdowns came, I was completely opposed to what the government was doing. And I was watching what was happening in Sweden, and indeed what was happening in Florida under Governor Ron DeSantis. I might mention him in just a moment. Now, terrorism, or more accurately, our counter-terrorism strategy, has come under some really pretty strong scrutiny in the last couple of weeks. We've just had the Manchester inquiry, the third inquiry into that horrendous suicide bomber who killed 22, mostly young kids, at that concert. And I have to say, the report just tells us about failure after failure. Salman Abedi was not referred to the PREVENT programme, and MI5 are being pretty frank in saying that he should have been. But even if he had been referred to PREVENT, we learnt last week from the Shawcross report that even PREVENT doesn't seem to be working properly. And bizarrely, 80% of the referrals to PREVENT are for right-wing extremism, whereas in reality, 80% of genuine police time dealing with terrorism comes from the Islamic threat. And perhaps because of all of this, our Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, has said that political correctness is actually stopping us from rooting out dangerous Islamic terrorism. Is she right? I have a sense that maybe she is. But Major General Chip Chapman, former head of counter-terrorism at the Ministry of Defence, will, I've no doubt, have a better and much more informed opinion than I do. Chip, good evening. Welcome to the programme. I mean, all of these reports, it seems to me, are pretty damning. Suella, is she right to say that it's political correctness or, frankly, cowardice that means we're not dealing with the problem properly?
Well, I don't think she is, because, of course, if you're a practitioner in counter-terrorism, you follow the threat, not any political correctness. And it doesn't matter if it's left-wing, right-wing, Northern Ireland terrorism, or the fourth one now, left and single-issued terrorism. if it stacks up that it's from any of those groups, that's what you follow. And that's why, for example, 66% of those in prison are from the Islamist persuasion, 27% currently from the right wing, and the remainder from those left and single-issue terrorists. It's also not really true that Prevent would have helped in the case of Abedi. So, for example, he was 20 when the statutory imposition came from the CT and Security Act in 2015, which gave schools and universities and the NHS a mandatory statutory requirement to refer people they thought was vulnerable. I don't think he was in that system, so that wouldn't have helped, even though Prevent has been in from 2003. So I don't think the thing is necessarily broken, and we've got to be really careful on how we look at this. But you follow the threat, not the ideology. That's what they do. Now, in the case of Abedi and the Manchester attack, you have to then go back to what was said afterwards. So about a week after, we, of course, had the London Bridge attack. As a result of that, the DDG, Deputy Director General of MI5, who was actually Ken McCullum at the time, now the Director General, led an operational improvement review. Did we get things wrong? And from the reports to that, which would probably feed in to the report of Sir John Saunders today, they said they got two things wrong. The first one was they could have potentially stopped him at a port, or the port's philosophy, that's ports, airports, train stations under a Schedule 7. The second one is Abedi in 2014 was a closed subject of interest. He was a subject of interest from January 2014. He fell off the radar to become a closed subject of interest in July 2014. The most amazing thing, really, is that using big data, machine learning and artificial intelligence, they had picked him out from 20,000 closed subjects of interest and were going to reinvestigate him, and had actually put him on the radar for a meeting, but that was going to happen 9 days after the attack. So he was on the radar. Yeah. It wasn't in a timely fashion. But like all these things, we have to remember that sort of being on the radar is not the same as if you're on the prioritisation grid, and there are people who at the time were far higher than him, which they probably prevented. And as a result of these operational improvement reviews, of which there were 104 recommendations, the key thing about when they were implemented in 2019 is, are we safer today? Because, of course, sadly, it is 6 years on from Manchester. I would argue we are safer today. It's largely lone actor attacks. They're very difficult to stop, but large plots are largely gone now. So, for example, to put some figures on that, 2019, 2 were killed, 2020, 3 killed, 2021, 1 killed in terrorist attacks. So the heyday of terrorism has gone, although, of course, Northern Ireland-related terrorism, we saw that horrible attack on the PSNI policeman in Northern Ireland last week.
No, Chip, that's a really good, very good, and actually quite encouraging explanation of where we are with things, because we don't hear about the good news. We don't hear, really, do we, about the attacks that are foiled. We hear about it when it's gone wrong. One final thought is that Suella Braverman did talk about grievance narratives, and this was very specific, and it was saying that if we investigate and look and start to criticise aspects of extreme Islamism, this gets taken by some elements of the media wrongly as being an attack on everybody of the Muslim faith, hence this grievance narrative. And what she was really saying is that when it comes to that particular terrorist threat, she thinks we're soft-pedalling, but you clearly don't agree with that.
Well, there's always been a strong prevent narrative, and that was really why it took so long for Shawcross's Prevent report to come out. Prevent is a good thing. It's to stop vulnerable people being drawn into radicalisation. If you're already radicalised, you wouldn't go into Prevent. You'd be in Pursue and be looked at by Counter-Terrorist Command and MI5. So Prevent isn't broken. It needs to be supported. And that was one of the things today that was actually said by Sir John Saunders, that the police welcomed and thought Prevent was a very, very good thing. It generally works. We need to support it. But there is a lobby of people who think that it is focused on the Islamic community. It is not. It's focused on all of those who seek to do harm to the UK of whatever persuasion.
Yeah. Chip Chapman, thank you very much indeed for joining us this evening on GB News. We're sticking with a fairly similar theme, my What the Farage moment from today, and you may have heard about this case, but it's a school just outside Batley in Yorkshire. And it involves a boy, it involves 4 boys, and one of them brought in a copy of the Quran. And the copy of the Quran got dropped and trodden on. It didn't get burnt or set fire to, as some of the sort of wilder reports suggested. But this was, and it probably was lads larking about. But this was taken to be causing terrible, terrible grievance. And we finished up with 4 boys being suspended from the school. One of the mothers has spoken out, making it clear that her 14-year-old didn't have any malicious intent, but these boys aren't currently at the school. And I just wanted to muse on something. Can you imagine if somebody, from whatever faith, had brought a Bible, the Holy Bible, into school, and the Bible had been dropped, trodden on, or damaged in some way? Do you think those kids would have been suspended? I don't. It does show a very mixed sense of priorities in what is supposed to be, or at least used to be, a Christian country. We'll take a break. Back with you in 2. Well, let's do a happy story. Let's do something that really thrills me and cheers me up. Now, of course, we know we must never, ever criticise Meghan and Harry. That's a terrible mistake. And if you're Jeremy Clarkson and you write something rude about them in the Sun newspaper, even when you've apologised, you find announced last night that he will not be doing, after the next one, any more series of Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. No, 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 no. If you criticise this couple, you get in trouble, because they seem to have quite deep support in the liberal media establishment. But anybody who watches this show regularly or listens to it will know I think their behaviour has been absolutely disrespectful to our late Queen and despicable towards his own brother and indeed his father, who of course is now King Charles III. They moaned like crazy, didn't they, about being put into Nottingham Cottage after they were first married. It was so small. Oh, you know, American stars coming to visit them couldn't believe the terrible conditions they were being forced to live in. Oprah Winfrey said, it's so small. Gosh, I'm sure you're all really pitying them living there. But the Queen came to the rescue and gave them Frogmore Cottage. Now, Frogmore Cottage are 5 houses knocked into one, and £2.4 million was spent for the Duke and Duchess of Suffolk to have it decorated to their heart's desire. So really, they've been having their cake and eating it, because they've been living on the west coast of America, making vast amounts of money from the book and from Netflix and everything else, slagging off the royal family, the Commonwealth, virtually everything about our country, but able, at will, to come back to Frogmore Cottage. Well, the King has acted, and I don't always agree with everything the King says, as you know, but he's kicked them out. He wants the keys back. Yes, they will not have Frogmore Cottage anymore, and it will go to Andrew, who, for him, and it must be horrible for him, really, to have to leave a 30-room home, but hey, he's going to go into Frogmore Cottage. Well, maybe I'm being a bit light-hearted about this, because I do think, actually, there are deeper, perhaps even constitutional consequences from this. And I'm joined by Rafe Hadel-Manku, royal commentator and GB News favourite. Rafe, some people have suggested that this is revenge coming from King Charles. If it is revenge, I have to say, I rather like it.
Yes, well, about time, I'm sure many will say. And I'm sure that, you know, cries of finally could be heard ricocheting around the kingdom, you know, as the British public heard about the King's decision, decisive decision, I should say, to give the Duke and Duchess of Duplicity their final just desserts and to evict them. You know, the King's been extraordinarily patient and tolerant. I think we can all agree, and you know, much like a good Christian monarch would, I think he was hoping that there would be a prodigal son moment where his wayward son would return. But you know, after all the temper tantrums we've seen from this crybaby and his delusional drama queen of a wife, it appears that it was the publication of Spare Harry's vulgar memoir that issued these vile attacks on Queen Camilla, that was the final straw for His Majesty. And the thing is, the King and the royal family aren't allowed to actually rebut or respond to any of this vile nonsense from Team Sussex. What the King has done here, actually, I was thinking about it, is sort of the equivalent of a government declaring a diplomat persona non grata. When an ambassador is declared persona non grata, they lose their residence and they lose their privileges and they have to leave the nation. And that's essentially what the King has done to Prince Harry, because this is actually quite a masterstroke. The practical reality is that he's not only evicted them from Frogmore, by losing Frogmore, they've actually lost their royal roles, which we'll discuss constitutionally, and essentially potentially been evicted from Britain. Because if you lose Frogmore, Harry's now lost his domicile status in the UK. And what that means constitutionally is that he can no longer be a Councillor of State. And a Councillor of State is a very important constitutional role, which means when the sovereign, the King currently, is incapacitated or abroad, there are 4 senior royals who can fulfil certain functions of the King. And Prince Harry has been one of those Councillors of State. But without any UK domicile, he's been very publicly and unceremoniously stripped of that. But also, the other thing is, by losing Frogmore, he's now lost the Windsor Castle Estate's Royal Protection Police officers and security detail, which means that he now feels that his only safe space in the UK has been denied him. And we've heard them say repeatedly, and it's been reportedly said by his supporters like Omid Scobie over the past couple of days, that they now may limit their number of trips to the UK. If they will actually come to the coronation, we'll see. Okay. So by losing Frogmore, they've lost their royal role, and potentially they've been evicted from Britain too.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Rafe. As I say, there is an important constitutional point here, and thank you for putting that very clearly to everybody. Let's just focus for a minute, if we can, on the coronation. It's about 9 weeks away, but it really is coming up very, very quickly upon us. As I understand it, an invitation has been extended to Harry and his wife Meghan, but they have said they will only come to the coronation if they're given an apology. I mean, I can't believe this, but this is what I'm told. If they're given an apology by William, Kate and the King. Is that about where we are?
Yes, so the invitation hasn't yet been confirmed as being sent or received, but we're expecting this to happen. But you're quite right. You know, I don't know what life is like on planet Sussex, but they seem to live in this alternative reality where up is down and left is right. I mean, it's quite inconceivable that you would, you know, launch a hail of abuse and attacks upon your nearest and dearest and then expect them to apologize. And you have to really ask, what are they apologizing for? You know, I mean, Harry should be lucky and Meghan should be consider themselves lucky that they're even getting an invitation to this great ceremonial event. And, you know, unfortunately, I think the problem is if they do accept this invitation, a lot of the media attention, which should be on the most important ceremonial and constitutional event our country has, the first coronation in 70 years, all focus should be on the King. And I just hope that we don't get this tracked distraction of Harry and Meghan and their ongoing fracas and, you know, turning the coronation into Coronation Street or something, if I could say.
No, I get that. Well, I hope they don't come. If they do, they'll be booed in the street. I know, because I'll be queuing outside to boo myself. But you said the coronation's all about the King. But a final thought, if I may, while I've got you. You know, we have learnt over the last few days that Camilla absolutely will not be the Queen Consort. She is going to be the Queen. And what I found interesting about that statement was there didn't appear to be any pushback against the idea at all. Do you think she's actually managed to win, despite a pretty rocky start, over the hearts and minds of the British public?
I think absolutely right. I mean, it must be said that Queen Camilla became Queen the moment that her husband acceded to the throne. She's Queen Consort with a small Q and a small C, but there's no official title of Queen Consort. She is officially the Queen. But what the palace has done very, very cleverly and I think very correctly is they've allowed the public to get used to the idea of a Queen Camilla in stages. So, of course, we first heard the Queen say that she hopes that the public will accept Camilla as Queen Consort. And then, of course, to avoid confusing having two queens so close together, Queen Elizabeth and Queen Camilla, quite rightly, I think we've had for this period references to the Queen Consort, even though she is really Queen. And then from the coronation, we will finally drop the consort and regard her as Queen. And yes, this has been a long process over the past 20-odd years of getting to know Queen Camilla, and everyone who's met her will say that the same thing, that she's extremely funny, down to earth, really unlike the sort of roles you would expect. The key task for the royal family and the monarchy is to impart that same feeling we now have for Queen Camilla around the Commonwealth realms, where they don't know her so well, and where she still is an unfamiliar figure. And unfortunately, 25 years after Diana's death, whenever there's a royal tour of Canada, Diana is brought up yet again after a quarter of a century. And I just hope now, finally that will be put to bed. People will see her for the woman she really is.
Rafe, thank you very much indeed for joining us tonight. As usual, informative and entertaining too. Now, folks, bit of breaking news. I said to you earlier on that the Daily Telegraph will be getting ready for their next big headlines. Well, one of them that's popped up already that'll be in tomorrow's newspaper seems to involve me. The headline is, "Can we lock up pub hooligan? Nigel Farage asks Hancock's team." Team wanted to take action against Brexiteer when he tweeted video of himself in a Kent pub after travelling to attend a US Trump rally. All right. OK, here we go. I'm going to fess up. When the first lockdown came, I thought, all right, I will accept that this vile Coronavirus Act has gone through the House of Commons, giving ministers powers we've not seen since the time of medieval kings. I didn't like it, but I obeyed it. But when I saw lockdown after lockdown, when I saw hysteria surrounding the number of times we all had to get jabbed, when I saw a media earning so much money out of advertising that there was almost no room for debate or criticism, and when I saw Matt Hancock standing up there and saying things like, "This is an order, you must stay at home," I thought, as the months went on, the hell with you. This is absolutely ridiculous. You're telling me I can't even go fishing. I can't even go on my own and sit, on a beach somewhere and fish. This is crackers. And frankly, I began to just not comply. And did I go and visit elderly relatives that I shouldn't have done under the law? Yes, I did. And I bet many of you did too. Did I meet the odd person for a drink in the garden when we weren't allowed to? Yes, I did. And I bet many of you did too. And that particular picture, when I had been to America, I was supposed to quarantine, I think, for 14 days. And was I, when I was photographed that day the pub's open, had I reached the full 14 days? Well, it was a bit nip and tuck. I think probably I hadn't quite reached the time. But you know what? Wherever I did, whatever I was doing when I was out there breaking these ludicrous rules, I always made sure I used hand sanitizer. I always kept my distance from people. And I have to say, bad laws make people lawbreakers. So there we are. I've fully confessed. If you think the worst of me for it, I'm sorry. But I just don't like tyrannical government. I don't like little pipsqueaks like Matt Hancock telling me how I should live my life. On that note, we'll take a break. So I'm going to be at CPAC, this big Conservative conference, for the next couple of days, and of course the star attraction is going to be Donald Trump. He comes every single year and speaks to grassroots Conservatives, just as Ronald Reagan did before him. The Trumps, well, they just never bothered because they were rather too establishment to go out and meet the great unwashed. Ron DeSantis won't be there tomorrow. He's governor of Florida. My guess is that he probably is going to have a run, and my guess is he doesn't want to take on Donald Trump too early. But we did learn something about DeSantis over the course of the last couple of days through the Times newspaper, doing a big interview. And what was interesting was, it's the first time I've really heard him. I mean, I've met him before, but it's the first time I've heard him come out publicly saying he's a big supporter of Brexit. He views Brexit and Brexiteers rather like the founding fathers of America when they broke away from us. But his comment on how Brexit's been applied really interesting. He says, my impression, based on what we get here, is that the Conservative Party hasn't been aggressive at fulfilling that vision as they should have been, and that maybe they'll get punished in the next election as a result of that. I do think that, there's been some disappointment from what I can tell that it hasn't been done more aggressively. Well, here. Seems to me Ron DeSantis has his finger very much on the pulse of UK politics, and whilst he may be a state governor, he's running Florida very well. And that means, and yes, of course, I'm a friend and supporter of Donald Trump, you all know that, but it does at least mean the Republican Party have actually got some quite good people to choose from, far better than the Democrats. Now, I'm worried about the closure of pubs. The one closest to my house closed just a few weeks ago. We're told there are 2,000 pubs on the verge of closing. It worries me because not just are they community hubs, but every pub is a parliament. It's in pubs where we openly debate things and think about things, and often have our minds changed. How serious is this, and what can be done? Well, Simon Cleary is the landlord of the Plough in Great Chesterford in Essex. Simon, twofold really. Number one, and I'm seeing it, living in Kent, not that far south of the river from you. Number one, how bad is this crisis? But number two, is there anything Jeremy Hunt can do in the budget on the 15th of March that might help to alleviate the problem?
Well, Nigel, it's very bad. And before we talk about that, can I just go back to your previous point about lockdowns? Lockdowns were horrendous for pubs. We had no income for nearly 8 months. We ended up with a bounce-back loan of £25,000 that we're now paying back on a monthly basis. And I don't know if your producers have told you this, but we're actually giving up. We're leaving this pub in 8 weeks' time to put some... Well, I've spoken to you before, Nigel. Yeah. When I've spoken to you before, we were talking about what may happen with energy bills. Let me give you some figures, Nigel. Our gas bill in 2022 for January was £438, including the Swindley environmental charge and VAT. Our gas bill that we received for January this year was £2,370, nearly 5 times as much. And there it is right there. Plus the additional historic debt we have, COVID, and it's just not sustainable. And it is with great regret that we're going to be leaving this pub in 8 weeks' time.
Well, Simon, I didn't know that, and yes, I have spoken to you before about these problems, and I'm very, very, very sorry to hear that. I genuinely am sorry to hear that. Is the pub trade finished in this country?
No, it's not. There are. It's very much location, like anything else. The big pubcos will put their support behind their managed houses. Tenanted and leased properties, I think, are going to suffer worst. And the other two things that are coming up, the budget, as you know, Nigel, is the 15th of March. And your question about what Jeremy Hunt is going to do is very prevalent. So at the moment, we're on reduced business rates, which is a hangover from COVID, which has been welcome. What's Jeremy Hunt going to do with business rates? We don't know. The energy relief scheme comes to an end on the 31st of March. Is he going to extend that? Now, he did say at the end of last year there will be provisions made for particular struggling or affected businesses, but there's no meat on the bones of that. Nobody knows what that actually means. I know from speaking to my contacts in the pub industry that people are very, very worried, and indeed, depending on what Jeremy Hunt decides on the 15th of March, it's going to affect big companies like the company we're with, Green King. We don't have a problem with Green King. They've treated us reasonably well over the time we've been here. But they're looking at problems that could amount to tens of millions of pounds in the short term.
Simon, thank you very much for being a regular guest with me here on GB News. I'm desperately sorry to hear what's happened to your pub. I really mean that. And good luck with whatever you choose to do next. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Nigel.
Well, there you are, folks. That's modern Britain. That's modern Britain. That's what's going on. Time for a quick barrage. The Farage. Mick asks me, does the country need a parents' union so action can be taken against schools which seek to poison the minds of children they teach? Well, I thought what was happening yesterday with that drag queen telling 11-year-old kids there are 73 genders and that girls can take a piece of skin off their arm to make a fake sexual organ, I'll leave it at that, was sick. I'm in America here. They have elected school boards. Parents can actually stand for school boards and fight back against this stuff. It is a damn sight harder in the United Kingdom to do that. So maybe whether a parents' union's the answer, I don't know. But Mick, what I do know is parents need more of a voice. Well, we'll see what that Telegraph piece of my confession does. I don't suppose the long arm of the law is going to find me here in America. I'll be back with you, hopefully, on Monday. But for now, I'm going to hand you over to Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Well, thank you very much, Nigel. I'm sure everyone enjoyed your programme hugely. We've got some really exciting stuff coming up over the next hour. We're going to be looking at the Sue Gray defection from the independent civil service to the Socialist Party. Does that undermine the whole idea of an independent civil service? And does it mean that her report into Boris Johnson that brought him down is invalid? We're also going to read from fantastic Mr. Fox. But now, the weather.